It's now my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker tonight. I've had the opportunity to get to know him over the last couple of months. Dr. Brad Wilcox is a distinguished university professor of sociology and the director of the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia. He's a Future of Freedom Fellow at the Institute for Family Studies and a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He's the author of Get Married, which some of you might have gotten a copy of this evening. Why Americans Should Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization. That sounds like a good book to read. Dr. Wilcox studies marriage, fatherhood, and the impact of strong and stable families on men, women, and children. Wilcox is the author and co-author of 6 books. This guy's pretty smart. And has written for scientific journals such as the American Sociological Review and the Journal of Marriage and Family, as well as popular outlets like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, and National Review. I'll invite you to join me once more. Friends, won't you help me welcome to the stage this evening, Dr. Brad Wilcox. I'll get that one.
Thank you, Mitch. It's hard to go after a Baptist preacher, so bear with me tonight here a little bit. So I'm delighted to be here tonight with the kind of correct term of art is NC Family now. Is that that's the correct new name? Okay, that's great. And I want to kind of begin my remarks tonight by mentioning my wife Danielle, who's back at our home with 6 of our kids. So she's kind of holding down the fort at the Wilcox household in Charlottesville, Virginia tonight. And I'm grateful to Danielle for many things, including the idea for the opening story tonight. This is kind of her idea to kind of use this ancient myth as a way of talking about some key themes in American family life today. And it's the story of King Midas. King Midas had a good life. He worked hard to protect his kingdom. He was respected by his subjects, and he loved his daughter. But it wasn't enough. He wasn't as popular, as powerful, as rich as some of the other monarchs in Asia Minor. Midas wanted to stand out as a singularly successful sovereign. And one day he got a shot at his ambition. Dionysus, the god of wine, offered Midas one wish. "I want everything that I touch to turn to gold," said King Midas. "Are you sure, Midas?" said Dionysus. "This could end badly." Midas answered in the affirmative. Midas got his wish. He walked about his kingdom, turning everything that he could into gold. At first, he was gleeful, thinking of all the riches and glory that would come his way. Midas started to daydream about his ambitious agenda to take his kingdom in the 21st century and the New York Times profile and multi-million follower account on Insta that would follow. But when Midas returned to his castle, he was in for some surprises. He tried to have a meal, but everything that he ate turned to gold. This got him a little bit worried. And unbeknownst to him, his daughter came up behind him to give him a kiss. And before he could warn her, she kissed him and was also turned to gold. Midas realized that he had made a grave mistake. His beloved had been turned into a rock. Despair filled his heart. This power that he had sought with such a singular focus, Midas realized was not a blessing, but a curse. Again, not a blessing, but a curse. So I think this ancient fable could not be more relevant for our day, because the new elite messaging that we're getting online and in the media and in the academy about work and freedom and family is advancing a kind of Midas mindset. This mindset discounts the importance of marriage and family. Forging a meaningful and happy life, we are told, is to be found in a rewarding career, in money, in freedom from all of the encumbrances of family life. This message is that basically mammon is more important than marriage and family, in today's culture. Now, this kind of came home to me as I was finishing up my book one night, and there was a headline kind of trending in the BEM days. That's the before Elon Musk days. And this headline was this, trending from actually Bloomberg. It said that women who stay single and don't have kids are getting richer. Okay, kind of telling us that from this Bloomberg reporter's perspective, the kind of path to prosperity for women kind of ran away from marriage and family and not towards marriage and family. Now, of course, that's false. But this article also had profiles of a lot of single and childless women who were not just kind of prosperous from their perspective, but also kind of living their best life emotionally as well. Women like Ashley Marrero is kind of pictured here in this screenshot. She's a 43-year-old professional splitting her time between high-end properties in New York City and the Jersey Shore, and she takes, quote, frequent travel for pleasure as well as work. So by profiling women like Ashley, Bloomberg was kind of telling us that the recipe for a meaningful and happy life leads away from marriage and family and not towards it. In her words, I love my life and feel very fulfilled. And of course, this anti-natalist and anti-nuptial message is not just found in Bloomberg these days. Here we've got The Atlantic making the case against marriage. We've got the New York Times telling us that married, heterosexual motherhood in America is a game that no one wins. And I'm sure you've kind of seen this message articulated in many different contexts, primarily kind of from a left-leaning perspective over the years. And again, primarily targeting women. But of course, what's new for our moment and for our days, we're also kind of getting this message now targeting men from the online right, what's called the red pill right, with people like Pearl Davis here on the left and Andrew Tate getting a lot of attention for their idea that marriage is a bad deal, again, not for women, but for men. So Andrew Tate, for instance, who, if you don't know him, is very big online. A lot of teenage boys and young men are kind of following him and kind of taking cues from him, has kind of this to say about marriage. He says, the problem is there is zero advantage to marriage in the Western world for a man. If you use your mind, if you use your head instead of your heart, and you look at the advantages to getting married, there are absolutely none for men, kind of from his perspective. So he thinks that men should focus instead on getting strong, on making a lot of money, and on using but not investing in the opposite sex. So again, kind of an anti-nuptial, anti-family message now is coming from the right, and it's targeting men. And so kind of in their own ways, they're examples of this Midas mindset that's become more and more, I think, common in our culture, telling us again that the path to a meaningful and happy life runs away from the family and not towards it. And I see this even among my students at UVA today. I was talking to a recent graduate named Holly, and she kind of had this to say about her perspective. She said, UVA students are definitely more focused on their education and getting their careers started than getting into a serious relationship, is what she said to me. If it happens, great. But the focus is definitely on building our own brands first. Basically, the thought process is relationships and love are a risk, but you always have your career and success to fall back on, at least while you're young. Okay, so again, a pretty good articulation, too, of the Midas mindset from a recent UVA graduate. And we're seeing kind of this view now kind of affecting kind of the hearts and minds of our young adults here. In this case, you kind of can see some new evidence from Pew looking at kind of teen attitudes. And what it shows us is that kind of looking at a career as kind of the ultimate kind of important, kind of objective for life is the topmost kind of view for teenagers. And by contrast, only a minority of kids are kind of embracing marriage and parenthood at the bottom of this Pew figure. So it kind of gives us a sense, again, of sort of the way in which a lot of people today are prioritizing things like money, education, and especially work as kind of like the source and summit of their lives. But I'm a sociologist, as Mitch mentioned, and I want to know what the data tell us about what actually leads to a more meaningful and happy life. What do we see kind of in the research? What does what's called the general social survey tell us? It's kind of a real keen and important benchmark for looking at Americans' social attitudes and experiences in America today. And what the GSS tells us is that yes, things like education, work, and money are predictive in today's world of, for instance, greater happiness. But there's something that matters even more for Americans today. What we see in the general social survey is that nothing compares empirically really to marriage when it comes to forging a meaningful and happy life in the GSS. So we see in particular is that, yes, you can see here on the screen that having more education in orange, having more money here in yellow, or even having a satisfying career here in red, these are all things that are linked to more happiness for ordinary women and men across the US. But simply being married is a better predictor than education, money, and work in the GSS. And there is no variable, again, no variable that compares when you look at these data to having a good marriage. So in other words, marital quality is really the best predictor that we see in the data of having a happy life in America today. In fact, what we see is that the odds of being very happy with your life increase by a staggering 545% for Americans who are in a good marriage. So I think this makes sense, though, if we kind of recognize and appreciate that Aristotle told us that we are, by nature, social animals. What he's getting at there is that our ties with others, with family and friends, are crucial to our welfare. They afford meaning and direction and a sense of solidarity to our lives, opportunities both to give and to receive care from others. So it's these ties and not the priorities associated with the Midas mindset that end up being most important today for Americans' happiness. So I think the Midas curse then today for our country, for our society, is that too many Americans are either having difficulty finding a spouse or not prioritizing, marriage in the first place. And we are seeing when it comes to, for instance, trends in happiness, as this slide indicates, that happiness in America is coming down, and that the research tells us that the number one reason why that's the case is that fewer and fewer Americans are able to put a ring on it or are prioritizing putting a ring on it. And so for my book, Get Married, I interviewed a number of young adults, both married and single, and found that generally speaking, the young adults that I was speaking to who were not married were more likely to be struggling. I'm thinking here of a young man named Scott, and by the standards of kind of like the Midas mindset, nothing should be wrong with Scott. Again, nothing should be wrong with Scott. He's in his mid-30s. He's got a college degree from Clemson, an engaging career as a military contractor, a house of his own, and a good-sized bank account because he earns more than $100,000 per year. But these educational and professional accomplishments are not enough for Scott. He says, I've got degrees on my wall, I've got accomplishments and certificates, but it doesn't mean anything in the end, is what he said to me. It's not like I could take any of that with me after I die. Scott feels alone and at sea on many a day. Could I have to get up every day and look in the mirror and realize I am alone? I have nobody. And he worries about the kind of fate that might await him if he should ever fall sick later in life. I have no help, If something happened to me tomorrow, there'd be no one for me. So Scott's struggling with a kind of toxic mix of loneliness, meaninglessness, and sadness. Now, I want to be clear here tonight, obviously. We know that there are plenty of folks who are single and are flourishing, and we know plenty of folks, I think, in our own lives who are married and are floundering. But in general, and on average, it's a problem that the marriage rate in America is down 60%. It's a problem that only 1 in 3 young adults today are predicted to marry. 1 in 3 young adults today will never marry. This is a record share So basically, if you have grandkids or adult kids or siblings in their early 20s, what we're seeing kind of now is that we're projecting that, again, 1 in 3 of them will never marry. So this is a problem because the research is telling us that this decline in marriage across this country is fueling an increase in unhappiness, as this study here from a University of Chicago economist, Sam Peltzman, tells us. Okay? So this is the bad news tonight, that marriage in America is down, and that's tremendously important for so many adults across this country of ours. But the question then you might be thinking, is there any good news from Wilcox tonight? And I do have some good news to convey as I kind of bring in the second half of my comments tonight. And the good news is that a large minority, almost half of Americans today, are forging what I call family-first marriages, where they're prioritizing their families, and they're reasonably happy, and they're typically living stable marriages as well. And there are 4 groups today who are especially likely to be kind of forging these family-first marriages. And those 4 groups are Asian Americans, religious Americans, and then a group that I call strivers or college-educated Americans. As I kind of launched this research, I expected there would just be those 3 in the data. Again, the Asian Americans, the faithful religious Americans, and then the strivers or the college-educated Americans. But as I did the analysis with my colleague, Dr. Wendy Wayne, what we found was there was a kind of a 4th group or a 4th factor in our analysis that also kind of mattered today in America, and that was ideology. So we found in our research that today, being conservative is an independent predictor of getting married in the first place and being happily married in the second place, even controlling for things like race and ethnicity, religion, and education. So these, again, are the 4 groups that we see who are doing pretty well, typically, on the marriage and family front. And because of their success, we're also seeing that they're reporting greater meaning in their lives and greater happiness as well. So what's their secret? Well, one of the subtitles in my book is Defy the Elites. And what I see culturally for a number of these groups, they tend to be kind of pretty good at defying a lot of that conventional wisdom in our culture, kind of defying what might be kind of propagated by mainstream media, by our universities, and now oftentimes on social media. And I'll focus tonight as I kind of wrap things up just on 3 different pillars of their kind of success: communion, commitment, and community. These are all things that kind of represent their ability and their capacity to kind of defy the elites today in America. Okay, so when it comes to communion, I think too often our elites are stressing a kind of me-first approach to marriage that privileges autonomy and freedom and self-interest. Okay, so this is kind of the elite messaging around life and often even love and family. One example is in the domain of money. And of course, money is important in marriage, I think, as probably most of you can appreciate. What a lot of financial professionals, journalists, and gurus now are encouraging couples to do is to have kind of his and her money. Okay, so we see here that Susie Orman is encouraging spouses to have their own, for instance, nest egg in their relationship. This is kind of one example of this me-first approach to marriage, in this case, when it comes to money again. But as I spoke to sort of ordinary couples across the U.S., I had this sense that couples who had a different approach to money were more likely to be succeeding. Thinking here, for instance, of John and Maria Erickson and their story about money and marriage. Now, when this conservative couple met, they were in the 82nd Airborne, and they gotten engaged. They were getting ready to deploy to Iraq. And Maria headed out to the store one night to get some items for both of them, and her list included some expensive items like ballistic glasses. They were really expensive, she said, something like $160 is what she said to me. And so when she brought these items back to John, she made it clear to him that she expected to be paid back. And in fact, her parents had kept separate accounts when she was growing up. But John just kissed her on the forehead and said to her, "What is yours is mine, and mine is yours, and now we're going to get married, and it's all going to be equal." This is kind of like the first real sign that she had that their approach to money was going to be different than what her parents had done. It actually kind of fueled a virtuous cycle of communication, trust, and mutual dependency as they merged their finances after their wedding day. And the irony here, too, is that she benefited pretty quickly from this arrangement because she brought a lot of debt into their marriage from her graduate studies, and John brought zero debt, into their marriage. And so again, like this whole approach, this we first approach to money was good for them. We see in the research is that couples who kind of take this approach in the sort of lighter bar and these two sets of bars are more likely to be happy in their marriages, and also to sort of say that divorce is not likely to be in their future. And there's just actually lots of other research besides this bar. This is from a YouGov survey I did with some colleagues, kind of coming to a similar conclusion. So again, what we're seeing is that kind of taking a we-first approach to money is linked to better marital outcomes across this country. And of course, the broader point here is that when it comes to communion, fostering a sense of communion in your marriage, this we before me approach to marriage tends to engender a sense of unity, teamwork, and mutual service that helps couples to flourish. Okay, so that's the kind of point about communion. What about commitment? And again, I think we can recognize today, and really since the 1960s here, that in the name of things like choice and freedom, our elites are often kind of encouraging us to dispense with older ideas about marital permanence, and even now today, ideas about things like sexual fidelity and even monogamy. And of course, I think the most sort of salient example that I've seen in the last year and a half on this score is sort of the push for polyamory. In the New York Times, in the Wall Street Journal, in New York Magazine, there's even a new series on Paramount called From Couple to Thruple that kind of makes the case for polyamory. But this article kind of in the New York Times kind of took the cake for, I think, the title that sort of gives us a sense of this new emphasis. It said, quote, how a polyamorous mom had a big sexual adventure and found herself. Again, in the New York Times, okay? But as I spoke to ordinary couples across the US, I had this sense that couples who kind of took a rather different approach to marriage were more likely to be flourishing. I'm thinking here of a guy named Patrick, who's actually not conservative or religious, but is very family-oriented. He lives in Central Virginia, not too far from me. He's tall, he's handsome, he's a well-spoken redhead. He travels a lot for his work. He plays guitar in a band on the side. And he meets a lot of people, too, in his work. And these might be things that could put his marriage at risk for infidelity. But Patrick is intentional about protecting his marriage in real life. He said this, when I'm meeting new people in my line of work, I talk a lot about my wife and kids. I want them to know I'm a family man, is what he said to me. And then online, he's got some rules. He said, quote, my wife is tagged in a majority of my posts. My status is listed as married, and interactions online are treated the same way as if in person. I do not follow old girlfriends, as there's a reason that they're in that category. So the fence he's kind of built both in the real world and in the virtual world is linked to a stronger marriage for him and his wife, Kelly. I asked her to rate their marriage on a scale of 1 to 10, and Kelly gave their marriage a rating of 10, of course with 10 being the best outcome for them. And again, they're by no means outliers. What we see in what's called the GSS again is that Americans who take kind of the yellow view, that is that any kind of sex outside of marriage is always wrong, are happier in their marriages than Americans who kind of take the more progressive view that that's not always wrong. And of course, really since 2014, because of this push for polyamory, unfortunately, more Americans have kind of taken the red view in recent years. But the bigger point here is that we often see in the research, when you look at kind of different measures of kind of commitment, both in terms of prioritizing your spouse, but also kind of embracing kind of classic values about things like fidelity and things like marital permanence, that couples who kind of embrace these different measures of commitment tend to be much more happily married, and that oftentimes these measures are the kind of the best predictor of marital quality in the research. Then the final kind of pillar tonight to talk about is related to community. Community. And I think increasingly, again, the elite view is that one kind of community, religious community, is an obstacle to progress, to kind of living your best life and realizing your best love, okay? So one example of this came in a New Yorker interview with a sociologist, kind of talking about the role of religion in the lives of evangelical men and their marriages. And I kind of painted a portrait of the way in which, kind of from this New Yorker interview's perspective, more classical ideas about fidelity and the sacredness of marriage and human sexuality were making evangelical men guilty, if they were looking at pornography, for instance. Their wives were less kind of tolerant of this. And this was kind of leading to a lot of problems in the evangelical world. So if you kind of just read this interview with the New Yorker, you kind of have this sense, maybe faith is bad for families. Maybe it's kind of an archaic force that kind of holds people back, okay? But again, as I spoke to ordinary couples across the US, I had kind of a rather different sense of the role that religion plays in the lives of American married couples today. So I spoke, for instance, to Martin and Kimberly, a black Christian couple in the DC suburbs, and had a very kind of different sense of the role of religion in their lives. So Martin, for instance, said that even when he's on the internet checking out his favorite news and music sites, he's careful. Quote, I mean, it's one of those things where, the Bible is very clear about fleeing temptation, he said, adding, so yeah, certain sites I won't go on. He also mentioned that he meets kind of regularly with his pastor to kind of check in about kind of the character of his marriage, to kind of be held accountable for being a better husband and a better father to Kimberly and to their children. And Kimberly mentioned, too, that when she was younger, she was sexually abused as a child by a family member. So this kind of initially made both physical and emotional intimacy with her husband when they first got married more difficult, more challenging. Quote, but that's how prayer entered, because I had some stuff happen prior to us that made having sex challenging for me, is what she said. I'm like, okay, God, you're only going to heal this. Only God can really, truly heal this, is what she said to me. So both kind of through the power of prayer and by talking about some of the situations with her friends at church, was she kind of able to successfully navigate this challenge. And they're happily married now. They've got 4 kids. They're doing well. And again, what we see in the research on this whole issue of faith and family is that American couples today who are regular churchgoers together are about 15 percentage points more likely to be very happy in their marriages. This is kind of a big social science difference in the research. And we also see, too, that they're markedly less likely to get divorced. Work from Tyler Vanderbilt at Harvard tells us that women who are regularly churchgoers here in purple are about 47% less likely to get divorced than their female peers who are not regular churchgoers. What about sex, though? It's obviously kind of a preoccupation in our culture today. And the New Yorker kind of piece, I think, would lead us to suspect that religious or Christian Americans are kind of doing worse on the sexual front. But again, the data point in a very different direction. What we see in my YouGov survey here is that a majority of religious couples report having sex at least once a week, and only a minority of secular couples are reporting real sex at least once per week. This is a really large gap. This is the most surprising finding in my research for adults in the book. And what we see when we kind of look at some older data is that there was no gap between religious and secular couples on this domain back in 2000, but there now is a gap in favor actually of church-going couples. So it kind of tells us that a lot of the kind of takeaways from that New Yorker piece were in some ways, I think deeply deceptive. And then 2, we find that religious couples are more likely to say that they're satisfied with their sexual lives here compared to secular couples as well. So the bigger point here with the research on faith and family is that the kind of family-first values, virtues, and social networks that we find in many church communities tend to typically strengthen and stabilize marriage. Of course, we all know that there are exceptions. There are religious couples that are struggling. I've been married 29 years. There have been obviously tough weeks, months, days, in our marriage. But what I'm saying is that generally, couples who kind of take their faith seriously in America are more likely to be flourishing, based upon the research that I've done. And then more generally, and again, you wouldn't suspect this from Andrew Tate and from that New York Times writer, but generally what we see is that the happiest Americans in America tend to be masters of marriage, particularly religious and conservative Americans. That's because I think they've kind of come to realize and to embrace this idea that the path to a meaningful and happy life doesn't run away from marriage and family. It actually runs towards marriage and family. So again, tonight's bad news is that marriage in America is in retreat, at least right now. And that's in part because too many of our elites, I think, and now too many ordinary Americans have embraced the Midas mindset. They're under the misimpression that life is about money, work, and me, me, me. They've put mammon before marriage. This is a big mistake, as we've seen, because nothing supplies the kind of meaning, direction, and solidarity that marriage and family tend to do. The challenge then is that we must foster a family-first mindset for the 21st century in our schools, in our churches, our homes, and even in the State House. And I'm so grateful to the work that NC Family is doing here in the Tar Heel State on this front. The NC Family has led on in efforts to protect North Carolina children from the negative effects of pornography and social media, not to mention the crazy ideas that have infiltrated too many of our schools. The NC Family has also stood up for fidelity in the bond of marriage by defeating a North Carolina that protects that most sacred virtue. By defending a North Carolina that protects that most sacred virtue. In these and so many other ways, NC Family is defying the elites and helping ordinary men, women, and children across the state forge strong families. That's because NC Family knows that what matters most is not mammon, but the love that governs and guides our families. So thank you.
Check, check. We're not going to let you off that easy, Brad. Stay up here. No, gosh, I think that was really helpful information. We often talk about at the Family Policy Council, as we're sharing with legislators and others, that, what we hear often, families are the building block of society. That's what God intended. Not only did he create the relationship between man and woman, but he designed man and woman to come together into an intimate and complementary relationship called marriage. And that is the relationship in which sexual activity is to take place, where children are to be reared. And so there's a plan and a purpose there, and you've shared a lot about that, which is really helpful. And I know just from my life experience with my wife, it's not always easy, but it's the most rewarding thing that we have, I'll say that I have experienced. I won't speak on Lynette's behalf. But, and another thing that occurred to me while you were talking is when you talk about the Midas mindset, Monday I attended the funeral of my best friend growing up. And to be a part of that and to witness it was something that really touched me. And where that relates to this is nobody stood up and said, gee, I'm so glad Patrick made so much money. Or I'm so glad Patrick was educated at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Actually, we did say that, okay. They didn't say, if he had earned more money, things would be better, this and that. The thing was that he was a loving father, a loving husband, and a family man. And that's what everybody who spoke about Patrick said, because that's what he was. Those are the things that he valued. Those are the things when you come to that kind of situation where it's an end of life, what is the purpose of my life? What have I done in my life? You pointed out well that the current culture values certain things, but I would imagine most of us in this room value something entirely different, and that's the love that we have for our families. So, Brad, I guess my question to you is, a lot of what you talked about, and rightly so, are responses to cultural influences, many of which are not necessarily positive, but they're also kind of personal decisions that people make. I'm going to invest in relationships with my wife and my children, with my parents, with my friends and family, as opposed to, climbing that ladder as quickly as I can, or trying to make more money or do things that the world sees as valuable, the Midas things. As an organization that works in the public policy arena, a lot of the things that we talk about are personal decisions, but what can we do as an organization, as a group of concerned people that can help to create a better environment for families, for flourishing families in our state, and set more and more people up for success, for the things that really matter, as opposed to the things that the culture seems to value? You want to...
John, those are great questions. And I would say two things, really, in response to your observations. The first thing that I would say is we're kind of seeing this sort of Midas mindset and really dramatic declines in dating and marriage and fertility, not just in the US, but globally, from Thailand to Tunisia, of all places, even Turkey as well. I think part of what's happening here is that there's been kind of a technological revolution that's playing out across the world here. And people are being kind of exposed to this kind of Midas mindset, not just here in the United States, but across the globe.
That's his hotel key card. I think he might need that later.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'll be locked out tonight. So the point is that I think kind of a lot of young adults are kind of getting this sort of idea that, again, what matters is sort of, to use that UVA graduate sort of terminology, kind of building their own brands. It's the education, it's, travel, and especially it's sort of like the perfect job. Not realizing that at the end, as with your friend, no one's going to kind of sit around and reminisce about that, trip to, Tahiti or something, or, that perfect job. They're going to reminisce about the quality of the family and friendship of that person. So they're kind of missing that fundamental point. And so in terms of your work here in North Carolina, I think one thing that you're already doing, and I think are going to continue to do, is try to figure out ways to help our families protect our kids from big tech. And that comes to, right now, your work in social media. But I think we're going to kind of be now facing newer challenges with AI and, chat bots and other things coming down the pike. They're going to make us face even newer challenges, both with our kids and also, of course, with ourselves. So kind of helping North Carolina families kind of stand up to big tech here in this state and kind of giving them some legal options that kind of strengthen their hand as parents and spouses, but also kind of just trying to help us all figure out how to navigate this new technological world that we're dealing with that I think often tends to kind of corrode our families. So that's sort of one thing that I would say. And the second thing is that we see both with kind of teenagers and young adults, and even kind of think, unfortunately, parents, there's not an adequate appreciation of the role and importance of marriage and family. And so one way, I think, to kind of introduce the importance of marriage and family into, for instance, public schools and kind of the public discourse more generally here in North Carolina is to talk about the success sequence with kids and teenagers and young adults especially. And that's this idea that if you get at least a high school degree, and then you work full-time in your early 20s, and then you get married before having any kids, your odds of being poor are just 3% in young adulthood. And also your odds of kind of forging a stable family and your odds of being emotionally kind of resilient are much, much greater for folks who are following that success sequence. And we've kind of been working with states in Alabama and Texas and Ohio to get the sequence into public schools there, and I think it might be also a great thing for the state as well.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for sharing about that. I think the success sequence, something that we've spoken with our children about and encourage them to follow this path that's going to give them every opportunity to experience success as opposed to kind of inviting more and more challenges upon them. So, Brad, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. Anything else that you'd like to impart to our audience before we move on to the concluding part of our program?
The only thing I just want to emphasize too, again, I think there's so many messages out there in the culture and messengers who are kind of challenging the role of faith in American family life. And I just want to say that, yes, there are people who are struggling in our churches, and we've all, I think, probably who are here and our believers have struggled at points in our own marriages. But in general, I think we kind of just need to remind the culture that kind of coming to church and investing in your church. I find that like praying outside of grace at meals, for instance, is one of the most powerful predictors of marital quality too. So kind of trying to own your faith in your own kind of family context. These things are really good for us and our kids and our communities, and we shouldn't be sort of hesitating to kind of share that kind of social science with our communities here in North Carolina.
Very good. Brad Wilcox, thank you so much for being with us tonight.